All right. So, over in the United States, news has just broken that Jeff Sessions, Donald Trump's attorney general, has quit. Or perhaps I should say quit. He has been one of the most loud and vocal opponents of cannabis legalization. Brendan, how are you celebrating?
Well, I think yesterday was a big day because not only did Jeff Sessions resign, but also Pete Sessions in the Texas 32nd lost. And both of them were really impeding cannabis legalization in the United States. Jeff Sessions, both are drug war dinosaurs that were preventing the liberalization of U.S. drug laws. So we're pretty excited about this shift. And we're at a point now where 93% of Americans believe that medical cannabis should be legal, and 65% of Americans believe that cannabis should be legal for adult use.
Tilray's stock jumped 20% on this news. You must be feeling pretty good right about now.
We're excited. I've always said that legalization in the U.S. was more likely to occur under a Republican president than a Democrat, really for states' rights issues, individual civil liberties issues. And it's just another indication that we're seeing an entire paradigm shift where not only are we seeing legalization in individual U.S. states and in places like Canada for adult use and medical, but we're also seeing country after country around the world legalize medical cannabis.
So Tilray's stock has gone crazy this year since its IPO this summer. I'd like to ask, there have been big ups and downs, wild price swings. Are these price movements a distraction?
They are. We really focus on building long-term value. I've been doing this for 8 years, which seems like a lot more than 8. And we're in this for the long term. I always tell my employees, I always tell our investors, this is day one in this industry globally. We're at a point where there's 35 countries in the world that have legalized medical cannabis, and it's really clear to me how we go from 35 to 40 to 50 to 60. But this is just the start. And so for us, we have a very long-term strategy, and that's how we think about the growth of this industry. It's rare. It's rare in anyone's lifetime to see an entire industry emerge from scratch, and that's what is happening. We're seeing an entire $150 to $200 billion global industry emerge seemingly overnight.
A number of analysts have pointed out that the fundamentals of Tilray's stock are a little weird and questionable, given the fact that Tilray's market cap exceeded $20 billion a few months ago, putting it ahead of American Airlines, which is a giant. And yet Tilray makes only a fraction of the revenue of that company. How do you justify such a massive valuation?
Well, I think if you were looking for long-term global growth as an investor, I'd be more likely to invest in the cannabis industry than the airline industry. I can't think of another industry that's going to see country after country legalize cannabis and cannabis for adult use. And so it's a long-term growth opportunity. We had seen lots of companies go public in Canada on the TSX, and of course we looked at that, but we decided to go down a bit more of a difficult path by going public in the U.S. And when we chose a NASDAQ listing, at first we thought it would be impossible, but through a lot of persistence and lots of conversations with SEC and NASDAQ lawyers, we were able to do it. And the thesis was that there were U.S. and international investors who wouldn't invest in Canadian stocks, but would invest in U.S. stocks. And certainly the reaction from both institutional and retail investors seems to indicate that there were a lot of people interested in investing in this particular industry at a time where there just really aren't a whole lot of opportunities to do that.
I'd like to read to you a few of the comments that some analysts said about Tilray's stock. One short seller, Citron Research, said that the spiking stock of Tilray was, quote, beyond comprehension. The president of Electrum Partners, which is a cannabis advisory business, said that there was, quote, no justification for Tilray's valuation. And another analyst who goes by the rather playful moniker, the Wolf of Weed Street, He said, quote, that this is complete greed and irrational exuberance, and a lot of people are going to end up getting hurt. How do you respond to these criticisms?
So I think this is a global opportunity, right? That's the first thing that you have to grasp. The second is that there tends to be a misconception that cannabis legalization is something specific to California or Colorado or Canada or North America, but in fact it's a global paradigm shift. We export today from Canada to 11 countries on 5 continents, medical cannabis, all of which is sold in pharmacy. I'm not sure which direction north is, about 2 hours north of here, we have a facility that's being built out in Cantanhede, which is in between Lisbon and Porto, where 2 weeks ago we harvested our first outdoor crop of cannabis. It was the first harvest of THC plants in Portugal. And the idea behind that facility, we've invested about 20 million euro in that facility, and we'll continue to invest more. The thesis behind that was that we would begin producing products inside of the EU for the EU, so that we could export from Portugal to other European Union countries for pharmaceutical purposes. And so that's the reality behind the industry. And while we only import into 6 countries in the EU today, it's really clear that country after country in the EU is going to legalize medical cannabis. Our products are available in Germany, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, Croatia, Cyprus. If you look at Italy, Denmark, these countries are all legalizing medical cannabis. And so it's a massive opportunity, and we don't even understand how big the addressable market is yet.
So as I understand, this Portugal facility that you're talking about is going to be your beachhead into Europe. How important is that going to be to your international expansion strategy?
It's incredibly important. We were concerned that all of our facilities were in Canada, and so in 2015 I started looking for locations around the world where we thought we could grow cannabis. We looked in the southern EU from Portugal and Spain to Italy and Greece. And when we came here, when we met with the regulators in Portugal, within the government and the investment agencies, we really liked the relationship and how welcoming they were for us to make this investment here. We also love the climate, right? Portugal has an ideal climate for cannabis. It has an educated workforce around pharmaceuticals, and so it made sense for us to be here. And we're excited to begin shipping product from our facility to EU countries next year in March and April.
Which countries do you expect to legalize marijuana next, whether that be medical or recreational?
Well, I think a big surprise. So we have about 35 countries in the world that have legalized medical, and it's clear that will continue to grow. 2 countries, Uruguay and Canada, that have legalized for adult use, Canada being the first G7 nation to do that. I think that one of the big surprises in the last 2 weeks was Mexico. Mexico, through the Supreme Court, made a big step towards legalizing cannabis for adult use. And I think that the legislature will legalize there, I think, in the next 6 months. If I had to pick another country in the world, I think there's countries such as the Netherlands and Denmark that could be a possibility, perhaps Australia too.
What goes into your predictions here? What sort of indicators do you rely on to decide which countries might be next to?
We look at everything. We look at Google searches. We look at other leading indicators such as same-sex marriage. We look at
what's the correlation between same-sex marriage?
We really identified that in the U.S. Years ago when we were trying to predict which states would legalize, and when we looked, Gallup asked the same question for 44 years. Do you believe cannabis should be legalized similar to alcohol and tobacco in the U.S.? And it used to be, it started at 12%. It's now at 65. 51% of Republicans believe that cannabis should be legalized. And when we looked at that chart over the last 40 years, it was really similar, parallel to gay marriage sentiments, and that really helped us indicate state by state and country by country which countries we think will be likely to legalize cannabis for adult use.
Have the midterm elections impacted your models?
So in the U.S., there were 31 states that had legalized medical cannabis. 2 new states, Utah, Missouri. Utah, very conservative state, legalized medical cannabis. So we're now at 33 states medically. And then we had 9 states that had legalized for adult use. And with Michigan, we're now at 10 states. So the model seems to prove out to be accurate. And we're interested to see how many more states over the next year or 2 will legalize. I think we'll see a number of states legalize through the state legislature and the governor signing a bill into law.
So you've described this massive market opportunity, but Tilray isn't the only company out there approaching this. One of your big competitors, Canopy, they've just received $4 billion worth of investment from Constellation Brands, the makers of beverages we like Corona and Negro Modelo. How can Tilray expect to compete with that kind of war chest?
So we raised about 175 million US through the IPO. After the IPO, about a month ago, we raised an additional 475 million through a convertible bond. So we now have about a little over $500 million, about 600 million US to invest in this industry globally, and we intend to deploy that capital quickly. I'm not sure how I would deploy $4 billion today. I'm glad I don't have that problem, but there are lots of investors around the world who are interested in seeing additional capacity being built to supply patients and consumers with safe, regulated, tested product.
I don't know, having $4 billion seems like a good problem to have.
I'm just not sure how you deploy that, looking at all the countries that have legalized.
What companies are most excited about this? Are there companies within pharma that you're having talks with, companies in the consumer products group?
So we have an alliance with a division of Novartis called Sandoz in Canada. Our intent is to expand that agreement to other countries around the world. And so the pharmaceutical industry is definitely under pressure to partner or work on products in this industry because medical cannabis is a substitute for prescription painkillers, primarily opioids, and so they're trying to figure out what their response is going to be to that loss of revenue. At the same time, the alcohol companies, so you mentioned Constellation, Molson Coors has also made an investment in the industry, and so the alcohol companies are terrified that cannabis is a substitute for alcohol, and they're terrified that cannabis beverages specifically will be a substitute for alcohol beverages. And the idea of a low or no calorie cannabis beverage that doesn't give people a hangover absolutely terrifies the alcohol companies. We also see a lot of non-alcoholic beverage companies, think companies like Coca-Cola or Pepsi, and CPG companies, think P&G or Unilever, looking at this industry, not because of THC, but because of CBD as an ingredient in these CPG products. And then finally, tobacco. And tobacco are really different from those first 3 groups. The tobacco companies are looking at cannabis as a way to increase the ROI on technology investments they've made in terms of nicotine delivery devices over the last 20 years. And that technology happens to be similar between tobacco leaves and cannabis leaves.
More countries have legalized marijuana for medical uses rather than recreational at this point. But what do you expect that revenue share to be down the line, recreational versus medical?
So it really depends. That's probably the hardest question you can ask because it really depends on how quickly additional medical countries emerge. And there's a really clear path, like I said, how we get from where we are today with 35 countries to 40 to 50 to 60. What is really unknown is country 3, 4, and 5 to legalize for adult use. I think Mexico made a giant step last week, but it's really unpredictable, difficult to predict how many countries will legalize cannabis for adult use over the next 3 to 5 years. Long term, We expect the entire industry to be $200 billion in terms of annual revenue, and I think that the ratio will be somewhere around 3 to 1 medical to or adult use to medical, but that's purely a prediction.
On a personal note, you quit your job at a private equity firm 8 or so years ago and decided to start a pot company. How did that conversation go over with your wife and family?
It was probably the most difficult part of doing this. I was working for a venture capital bank in San Francisco 8 years ago, 8.5 years ago, May 2010. And I saw an opportunity. We thought we saw a bunch of things that were going to happen. And I couldn't, once I figured out what I thought was going to happen, I couldn't not do this. And it was hard because then I had to tell a bunch of people what I was going to do. And I had to have a conversation with my wife, and probably more difficult conversation with my parents, who are 85, and tell them that I was quitting my job and going into the cannabis industry. And they're probably a little more Frank Sinatra than Grateful Dead, and that was a difficult conversation. But they were skeptical at first, but now my mother clips articles out of the newspaper and mails them to me, so they're very supportive.
Do you partake yourself?
I do, infrequently. I've never needed medical cannabis for a medical purpose. I grew up in San Francisco. I do enjoy consuming, but I travel so much. I think it was on my 120th flight of the year coming here. And it's challenging to find the right products in the right locations.
So we've got just a minute or so left. Tell us, what does the future of getting high look like?
I think it looks really different. I think people won't smoke cannabis. Some people will, but I think most people won't. People will consume beverages. They'll consume slips. They'll consume mints. I think that there will be lots of research around time to peak effect and how to decrease that, so that if you consume a beverage, you feel it within 12 to 15 minutes, similar to a beer. I think that people will dial in that time to peak effect and duration, so that it lasts maybe 30 minutes, and then you can either consume another beverage or not. I think that you will see different products for different need states, and what I mean by that is products that people consume on a Friday night versus to go out, and products that people consume on a Sunday night to go to sleep. And so it will really be about need state. And then you'll see more tightly pharmaceutical medical products for people who have epilepsy versus people who are going through chemotherapy for cancer treatment.
Well, we'll be looking forward to the day when we can all have cannabinoid Coca-Cola. Thank you so much for joining us, Brendan. That's all we've got time for. Thanks, everyone.